Hello and welcome back to the One Rule Church podcast. Right now, it's just Ashley and I. I'm Cara, for those who don't know. And hopefully, we'll be joined by Cherie and Leah sometime during this. But today, we are talking about purity culture. It is something that has been definitely on my mind and heart for a while. For those who follow my YouTube channel, my very first video was about getting pregnant outside of wedlock, and I mentioned in the video just some of my thoughts about sex outside of marriage or whatever, and had considered doing a video about it but never got around to it. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today. I posted in the caption of the videos and the posters that I shared about the talk that we're doing today, just a quote that kind of explains what purity culture is. But I pulled that from a website from an author. Her name is Linda Kay Klein, and she gives kind of like a general overview of purity culture, and I wanted to just read that to kind of set the tone and give everyone who may not know what it is just kind of like an overview of it, and then Ashley and I will kind of talk about what our thoughts are about this overview. So she says, the term purity culture is generally associated with the white American Evangelical Christian Purity Movement and the corollary purity industry launched in the early 1990s. However, evangelicals don't have a monopoly on the ethics that undergird purity culture. The specifics may vary. Mormons, for example, use the word worthiness instead of purity, while Muslims say honor culture instead of purity culture. But the foundation of gender and sexual control upon which purity culture stands is global, cross-religious, and cross-cultural. In purity culture, gender expectations are based on a strict, stereotype-based binary. Men are expected to be strong, masculine leaders of the household, church, and to a lesser extent, society. Women are expected to support them, to be pretty, feminine, sweet, supportive wives and mothers. Sexual expectations vary by gender. Everyone is expected to maintain absolute sexlessness before marriage. That means sexual thoughts, feelings, or actions. And upon marriage, they are expected to flip their sexuality on like a light switch. However, men are taught their minds are evil, whereas women are taught their bodies are evil. That is to say, men's thoughts and actions are to be either pure or impure, while women themselves are said to be either pure or impure. I'm going to say that again. Men's thoughts and actions are said to be either pure or impure, while women themselves are said to be either pure or impure. Sexual metaphors abound. A pure woman is compared to a brand new shiny car, while an impure one is compared to a used car that everyone around town has already driven and that isn't worth much anymore. A pure woman is compared to a delicious hamburger just set down on the table, while an impure woman is compared to the last slobbery bite of that hamburger, etc. Purity culture also teaches that women are responsible Purity culture also teaches that women are responsible for the sexual thoughts, feelings, and choices men make, and so must dress, walk, and talk in just the right way so as not to inspire sexual thoughts, feelings, and actions in them. If they do inspire such thoughts, they are said to be a stumbling block, literally a thing over which men trip on their pathway to God. To avoid stumbling blocks, men are taught to train their minds using strategies such as bouncing their eyes when they see something that brings out a sexual thought or feeling, such as a woman's cleavage in an advertisement or the knee of the woman sitting beside them at church. Underlying these teachings are several assumptions, including those that gender is binary and that heterosexual desire is the only right and normal form of desire/sexual intercourse. The white American Evangelical Christian Purity Movement is further based in nationalistic and white supremacist assumptions. As a result, purity culture influences people's lives in complex ways, resulting in highly intersectional marginalization. For example, whereas white American women may feel they must unfairly maintain the purity they are assumed to have been born with, American women of color and women from other cultures may feel that they must attain purity, as it is not something they are assumed to have been born with within the subculture. So, Ashley, what do you think?
Oh, wow. That was a lot.
It was.
That was a lot. I think now, is this Arthur white or black?
She's white.
Okay. And I thought that she was, because I think understanding of purity culture is very different from white evangelical versus black Christian, and or maybe other black families of faith that are not Christian. I'm not sure. I don't. I have Muslim friends, but I really haven't had the purity conversation with them about, in the context of Islam and their faith. I will say that coming from the perspective of Black Christianity, I do not think that purity culture is as preached or is as expected from men as it is from women. I think in Black Christendom, purity is the onus and the responsibility of the woman. I grew up in church all of my life, and I can very rarely remember a sermon being preached about the purity of men. Or about, men flaming, going down and burning flames because they weren't chaste. So, I think the conversation, especially in Black culture, is the onus is on the woman to maintain that standard of purity, to not be a stumbling block to your brothers, to maintain that level of decorum and modesty, and really have this burden of the duplicitousness of having to be pure, but then also having to be the sexual vixen once you are married. And I think that is a very dangerous, and I think it is a very dangerous juxtaposition and a very dangerous cultural identity that is steeped within the church, because it starts to teach a young girl very young that your value is only in your sexuality, while not actually exploring your sexuality. So for me, purity culture was, and I think more so than fathers perpetuating that, a lot of mothers perpetuate purity culture. Growing up in Black churches and Black families, sex is not really talked about. You don't talk about sex. All you hear is don't do it or you go to hell. Don't sin. In my family, it was being holy. You were taught to be holy. Don't have sex before marriage because you can get pregnant or you can get an STD. And if the rapture comes and you in the middle of sex, you're going to go to hell. These were the only conversations that were had about sex. So sex was a very nasty thing. You never learn about sex in terms of, I think, Black culture, especially Black Christian culture, you never really learn about it, sex or sexuality, in a positive manner. You only hear it in a negative manner of fornication, or you're shacking up, or when you do have a baby outside of marriage, you become the talk of the town and the talk of the church, and like now your sin is laid bare for everyone to see that you weren't living this holy and chaste life. So that's problematic. It's very problematic, because how can you expect someone to go from this virginal, chaste, pure, Mary-like complex to then switch over on your wedding night or in the course of your marriage to being this woman who's supposedly supposed to have all of these sexual powers to satisfy your husband, because in the Black church also, that is the woman's responsibility. But no one teaches you that. No one teaches you about sex and the intimacy of it, the pitfalls of it. Not even talking about the STDs, but the emotional part of sex. And are you ready for that? So for me, breaking out of that purity culture and not really, and in church, I really want to underscore, I think purity culture for women is something that is like used to define you and your worthiness of marriage. And that is by far the most dangerous and the most illogical thought pattern that there can be, because I even found myself, I think many of times, especially my friends that got married young, you didn't want to burn, you didn't want to go to hell, you didn't want to be living unholy, but then you also overlooked all of these other things about this person because he was willing to wait. So you skipped the dude down the altar at 24,
Not skip to do.
22. Girl, you ran down that altar, okay? At 22 and 23 and 24. Only by the time we're in our 30s, I'm 32, in my early 30s, most of my friends that got married younger now divorced because the marriage wasn't built on the right foundations. They were too young. And it was the pressures of church and the doctrines of their parents of not wanting to disappoint God and not wanting to be these people that aren't living it right, to, skipping to these marriages, which you weren't ready for. You didn't really know each other. And there were plenty of warning signs that you overlooked just because he was in church kneeling and praying with you while y'all were trying to abstain from sex. And I think that is one of the most dangerous parts of it, because then women start to really base their worthiness on how pure they can be, how long they can be celibate or abstinent, and how long they can hold out. So God will reward them with this, beautiful, godly, praying husband that, is the answer to all of their prayers because they were so pure.
No, I agree with that. And I think for me, and I think that she kind of said this in her in that write up at the end. She was talking about the assumptions. I think for me, a lot of what you're talking about, it relies on some of those assumptions that she alluded to. And I think not just from like a life perspective or just like what society says, but also relying on the theology that supports all of this stuff to be true. And this is something that I've seen across Christendom. I don't know necessarily about other religions, but specifically within Christendom, I see a lot of, because I'm saying that to say, I think in recent years, we've kind of seen people, kind of looking at purity culture a little bit differently and recognizing like we need to have these conversations about sex. We need to have these conversations about health and, making good choices if you do decide to have sex, because like, people are getting pregnant and getting STDs and having all these struggles because nobody is having these conversations with them about what needs to happen, about, just like what goes into all of that, I should say. And so I think, there's been at least somewhat of a movement away from how things were when we were younger, because you're 32, I'm 30. It was a lot different growing up in the 90s than it is growing up in church now. And so, I acknowledge that 100%, but what I think is problematic across the board, not just with purity culture, but with a lot of theology in general, is they'll take a step of progress, but instead of kind of digging deeper, it's like, we'll take this one step and think that it's enough. And you're still relying on those underlying assumptions, not even realizing that you're doing it. And so what happens is that instead of there being some kind of like fundamental change or fundamental evolution, you have this little bit of new information that gets kind of incorporated into all this underlying stuff that you're still choosing to rely on. And so instead of it being like something that's actually new and actually, some sort of evolution, it becomes kind of like a less facially damaging version of what we were already doing. And so, like, for me specifically with purity culture, I think that I see a lot of, it should be about relationship with Jesus and not, just don't have sex. It should be about your relationship with him and not the letter of the law. It should be about, finding your worthiness in Christ, not your worthiness in who you can be for a man. However, all of the theology all of that bad stuff was based on is more or less still the same. And so you have these women who are saying it should be about relationship, and your value is not in who you have or have not had sex with. Still saying, well, sex outside of marriage is a sin, and you shouldn't be doing that. And it is impure. It's still impure. It's still, is an indication that you don't necessarily value yourself the way that God values you. It's not God's divine plan, but it doesn't mean that you're a bad person and people should just throw you away. It means we shouldn't just give up on you because you've been out here doing whatever you've been doing. We're still going to love you. We're still going to work with you and do all of this stuff. But at the end of the day, the message is still the same. And so ultimately for me, the idea that how the message has been presented is the issue, rather than unpacking the message itself and considering that the message itself is what fueled the negative presentation of the message, for me is what is ultimately problematic. And I don't want to preach a whole sermon and get into whatever. Like for me, I don't believe, and I've said this before, I don't believe that sex outside of marriage is a sin, just because I don't believe that there's any consistent scriptural basis to make that a universal conclusion for everyone. And I appreciate that Linda Kay Klein's particular just like, I guess, explanation of what purity culture is, because she does kind of like touch on that. But I do feel like, for me, I feel like ultimately it should be your choice. And I feel like that's what church doesn't teach. I think that instead of empowering people to go to God first as the source and to see what God is convicting them of or what God is not convicting them of, to like give them the tools to go to God first and to make decisions based on what God is personally convicting them of, there's this like communal, this is what the standard is, this is what everybody needs to uphold, and there is no room for individual conviction. There is no room for you to do anything that, I guess, goes against what the group or the community has decided is right or good. And if you do go against it, then we're going to tell you that that's not of God. And the problem is your relationship with God, as opposed to the standards that we're basing our community on. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I agree. I think I find it very interesting how progressive, not even the world is, but how we like are very quick to pick things that are not aligning with our morals and our values now, right? If anyone in their mind today in Christendom, especially in Black church, looked at the Bible and somebody tried to justify slavery in 2021 with the word of God, we would be like, that, no, we just can't. Like, you're out of your mind. Like, there is no way that I'm going to go back to shackles because the Bible says.
Right. Right. You can keep that slave Bible like Rachel was talking about last week. No, thank you.
Slaves, honor your masters. But it's just so interesting how we don't do that kind of self-examination of where the text was, the historicalness of the text, and what the societal conditions were at that time. When you're talking about a time, especially when you're talking about Old Testament, where women and men were considered women and men at the age of 13. Okay? I grew up in a predominantly Jewish community. When I was 13, I probably went to like 100 bat and bar mitzvahs, being a mitzvahs if they were triplets or twins, whatever. I went to a lot of them. That was their coming of age. Historically, they will become men and women, and they will have, the rights bestowed upon them of men and women, marriage, and all the other the Judaic customs that came along, and the responsibilities that came along with adulthood. We are not getting married at 13. And if you got married at 13 now, and you tried to marry a person that was older now, we would call it pedophilia. Okay? We would be against it. But somewhere along the way, that line of thinking doesn't translate to sex. If I was getting married at 13 years old, I am not spending 30 plus years in the sexual prime of my life where all of these hormones are raging, my biological clock kicks into gear, and spending it celibate and abstinent. People did not spend, hundreds, like into their 40s, celibate and abstinent in the Bible days. They just didn't. So it's just interesting to me how we kind of pick and choose the text and we don't understand where it is. And then even when you look at the old Levitical laws, there are a whole list of sexual misdeeds, of unclean sexual relationships. Not one of them talk about sex between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman. So I just find it interesting that when we get to the New Testament and we're having these conversations, and a lot of times they're talking about the woman who used to found, I think, committing adultery with the men, that's used to justify not having sex outside of marriage. Or we take Paul's text, which I also have a problem with. I think that in the Christian church, we rely a lot on Paul. Paul's words don't always line up with the original text of the Bible. Paul says a lot that Jesus never said. We stand on Paul like Paul is Jesus. But, and that conversation that we have. So when you get to the conversation about sex and choosing to be a celibate, I agree with you, or abstinent, or choosing to have sex, I agree with you. It is a personal choice. And I think that we should equip, especially our young men and our young women, to have those conversations with them and say, like, sex is something that is not for the faint of heart. I don't recommend doing it so young. I have stepchildren, and I will want them to make a decision about sex when they are ready and willing to deal with the consequences, children or STDs, and, being aware of the emotional things that can come into play with that. And if you're ready for if you're ready for whatever that is, how you're going to feel afterwards, that's a personal choice. But I'm also not going to leave them out here in this world and be like, just don't have sex because, I don't want you to go to hell, or I don't want you to get pregnant. No, I want you to make a personal choice where you are ready to deal with the consequences of stepping into that adult world. And that is not a conversation we're having at church. That is not a conversation we're having with women. It's not a conversation we're having with men. That is just very much so, don't do it, or don't sin, or be pure so God can bless you with this fairy tale marriage that never happens, because nobody marriage is just like pure because you didn't have sex before marriage. Like, I did have sex before marriage, and my marriage is amazing. Okay. And we work at it. We absolutely work at it. But there are times that I will tell you personally, in the beginning, when things would come up and we would have to work through arguments and disagreements, that I would be like, is this God punishing me because we're having sex outside of marriage? And how many times I struggled with telling my husband, like, we can't do this anymore. We can't. And he would be like, okay. And then like 3 weeks later, I'm like, it was a very struggle. So then you start to think, like, anytime something bad happens or disagreements happen or something doesn't go your way in life, you're like, is this God punishing me because I'm having sex outside of marriage? And, this is my reward for my sin, and I think that's a very dangerous place to be in.
I agree. Leah, do you have anything you want to say? I don't know. Is she frozen? Oh, I think she is frozen.
I think she's, oh no, she's not frozen anymore.
Leah, do you have something you want to add?
For some really weird reason, the connection is bad. It keeps resetting about every 30 seconds. I'm not sure why. Last week, the connection was great. It just came in, so it didn't hear everything that was said. What I heard, of course, was like, I completely agree with. The things that I have to say are going to upset a lot of very conservative people, which, like, I'm fine with that. I frankly think that they should be upset because it'll trigger some critical thinking skills, perhaps, but maybe not also. I can dream. But yeah, I could definitely, it depends. Where would we, I mean, this is also like part of my work, so I could talk about it forever. What has been covered already, and like, what do you want to get into?
So we basically initially just kind of like, I read I don't know if you saw the quote caption, the quote that I think she's frozen again. Oh no. Well, okay. Can you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay. So
I might come in and out of the room again. Let me do that and see if it
okay.
improves. If it doesn't, then we'll just start over.
Okay.
We'll just
So
bide some time. I'll be back in a second.
while Leah's doing that, I will speak to what Ashley said. And then we do have a question that we can address. So I agree with that, with what you were saying 100%. And for me, I felt that when I got pregnant, because like in my own personal spiritual life, when I am doing something that I am convicted I should not be doing, I have no peace. Like the level of spiritual unrest is like I can't even live with it. And so I have never been one of those people who can just kind of like do my dirt and not feel any way about it. Like it just, that is not who I am. If I feel like I am going against my convictions, I will not have peace until I am living in line with my convictions. And so when I first moved to LA, I was dating my now husband, Jack. And, it was like, should we live together? Should we not live together? And it kind of just didn't make sense to live apart because we knew we'd be spending all of our time anyway. And so it was a waste of money. And at that time we knew that we were planning to get married at some point in the future. And so it was just like, it doesn't make sense to do that. And I never once felt any unrest, any spiritual unrest about living with him, waking up to him every morning, going to sleep with him every night. I felt nothing but peace and safety and love. And like, this is working for me. And so when I initially found out I was pregnant, this was like 6 or 7 months into us living together. I was just like, first of all, like, there's no way, because I was on birth control. Like, it's like this isn't even supposed to be a thing. But then, like, reality set in, and it's like, oh crap, like I really am pregnant. And it took me a couple of months, like the first 2 months of that pregnancy, I was just trying to wrap my head around it and how I felt, because my first question was, is God punishing me? Like, was I doing something? I thought that I was fine. I was in a place of spiritual peace. Maybe I was not paying attention, or, I missed some signal, something that God was trying to communicate to me. And so am I being punished? Because that's what they say. If you're living in sin and you get pregnant or whatever, these are the negative consequences of your bad decision making. And it was actually, I am pro-choice through and through, but it was actually some pro-life websites that helped me kind of like, I think, reframe my thinking about getting pregnant. And just like, there are people who I realize that there are people who do everything right and, want a baby and are trying and can't have one. And it's not a punishment from God that they can't have a baby. And so why would it be a punishment from God that I'm having one, that I'm being blessed with one? Like there's no scenario where bringing life into the world, in my opinion, should be viewed as anything but a blessing. And to think about, because what I didn't like was they were saying, the baby is a blessing, this life is important. And so even though you made a mistake, you did something wrong, that's not the baby's fault. And I'm like, no, like we have to run this logic through. If this is a blessing, this is a good thing. God is blessing me. Why would God bless me on the heels of something bad? Why would God bless me and put this life in my hands? Give me such an awesome responsibility. if it's on the heels of me being terrible in God's eyes? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. And so just kind of like taking all of the rhetoric and dogma and all that stuff out of it, and just, kind of seeing how I felt about it, how I felt about what I was feeling in terms of like how I believed God felt about me in that moment. It was like I didn't feel like I was sinning or doing something wrong before. Why would I suddenly take all of that stuff on now, just because this is what my indoctrination has been, pounding into my head for my entire life? And so just kind of like letting go of all of that, and understanding that there were going to be people who were going to judge and say whatever, because I was still Christian at the time. My community was still almost exclusively Christian. And so I knew people were going to have their thoughts and their feelings, whatever else. But I just chose to honestly just like block all of that out. And it was the same thing that I had been doing in terms of like my sexuality and the decisions that I had been making with regard to my relationship with Jack, even before that. And it was just like, it's all consequences of decision making, right? Like that's the end of it. And you're a life being brought into this world. You can't choose it one way or the other. Like you don't just get pregnant because you want to get pregnant, or not everybody can do that, right? And it almost never happens just like on a dime. Like, oh, I decide I want to get pregnant, and then suddenly it happens. Like it just doesn't work that way. And so even just taking that out of it, and just thinking about the decisions that I had made, like I really didn't have anything to lose. Like I was in a relationship with someone that I genuinely loved and cared about, who I believe genuinely loved and cared about me. I had every confidence. I was not going to be laying down with anybody who I did not believe would want to be involved with me and a child if that was something that resulted from our sexual relationship. That because, if you're having sex, it's always a possibility, right? And so I just wasn't, it's like, it's not happening if I can't trust you to do the right thing, not really even by me for real, but by the baby. Like we're not even sharing space. And so I was in a relationship with someone who I knew was going to be there. But even if he, flipped the script on me and decided not to be, I knew that I had a family and a home to go back to, and people who would support me and be there for me and my son, and help us do what we needed to do so that I could be self-sufficient and stand on my own 2 feet and be a good mom to Judah. And so like, even in making those decisions, it's like, it's wild to me that instead of teaching people how to just make good choices so that they don't end up in situations where, there's nothing but bad options, like you tell them just don't do it. And anything negative that stems from the act of just having sex outside of the confines or parameters that we have set in place, anything negative that happens is because of this thing right here. And not even taking into consideration, not just the negative impact it has on the woman, but the stigma and everything that it puts on the child. Like I said this in my video, but I had to tell my mom, like, because she was like, you made a mistake, blah, 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 but that's okay. And I'm like, no, like, and I don't want you ever to say around my child once he's born that he is a product of a mistake. No, he's the product of love, period. He's the product of love. And, God, it wasn't planned, but he's not the product of a mistake.
I remember, so we're Facebook friends, and I remember when you popped up on my timeline, and I was like, damn. It's like, I wonder what her family said. I wonder what the church said. Like, I felt for you. And then, like, there was a moment, and I was like, damn. And, oh, sorry. Sorry, Jesus. There was a moment where I was just like, man, and like, what is she going to do? I know they're going to come for her. And then, and then there was another thought that I'm like, but she looked happy in her relationship. So like, there was just the immediate indoctrination came up in me, and I was like, man, we out here, bro. Now they know. Right. Like, there's no doubt. And then the second thing popped up, but I was like, but is she like, she's not wrong. Like, she's living her best life and she's happy. And So it was funny because when I saw that, I was just like, and I felt for you, and that, like, of all the things that, because I know, like, being a member of a first family and having to come and have that conversation with your family, and then when you start to show, having that conversation, or that not the conversation with the church, but that conversation being had about you and the church is not an easy thing. And I really, I felt for you in that moment. I'm like, we're not even that close, and I'm like, but I'm rooting for her. I was like, because the reality is, this is hard to be a young woman in your 20s or 30s trying to figure out marriage and a relationship with a man and not to engage in sex, especially if you have love for each other and you want to be with each other. I was like, it is extremely hard. And I'm like, so what, I didn't judge you for that, but I'm like, man, I felt for you in that moment. Because I'm like, I know that has to be hard. If I had come home at any point, and had to have that conversation with my mom, I would have felt extreme, or my family, or having to present that to the church. There would have been extreme shame. And like, especially if you've been the good child and you've had like this, not the good child, but you've been this poster child for goodness in the church community of everything you're supposed to be doing. And then you do the like excommunicable sin and get pregnant before marriage. It's really it's really hard. So like, I've admired how you were just out here like, nah, I'm gonna get married when I want to get married.
Yes.
I'm gonna have this baby. I'm gonna be on Facebook. I'm not,
because there was pressure for that too. Like,
I'm
it
sure,
was like, okay, well, yes, like, you're having this baby, you guys love each other, you're gonna get married anyway, get married before the baby is born. And I'm like, for what? First of all, I'm trying to be fine on my wedding day. Y'all got me messed up if you think I'm getting married with this big old belly. Like, no. We're coming to slay, and I can't slay with an empire waist and my belly out to here. It's just not happening.
Right.
No Bridgerton weddings for you.
Right. But beyond that, it was like, I'm not getting, and I appreciate, so like, let me say that, like, my family was super understanding, and like, my parent, I love them because like, my mom had told me some years ago, like, I'm always gonna love you. If you tell me something that's like disappointing or whatever, just give me like 10 minutes to be a mom, and then I will get it together. And she didn't even have like one of those moments. Like, it wasn't, it was, I was expecting it to be a thing, and it was not really a thing at all. And Jack's family, like, they were like, oh yay, we're having a baby. Like, it was like, it wasn't a conversation with our families in terms of like, oh, you had sex, and because like, everybody knew it.
Right.
It was
I was
like,
just about to ask you, especially like
yeah, everybody knew we were living together. And so it was just like, okay, it happened, like, whatever, let's just make sure that we're ready when this baby comes. And so that was fine. My church family, like the immediate family, was fine. I was not the first young girl in our church to get pregnant. And I wasn't very young. I was like 27. So it's not, I was 27, Jack was like 32 or something like that. So it's like, we weren't like children either. And so it wasn't the first time it had happened. None of those women were, ridiculed or ostracized or anything like that. So that didn't happen to me. It was more so, just like the people on the outer fringes who may have had an opinion or something like that. But most of that I was shielded from anyway, because I wasn't engaging. But
can I tell you that I didn't know you at that time? I mean, I knew you, but I knew you as your husband's girlfriend because I'm your husband. And I got into arguments with multiple people who were trying to talk smack about you. I did, like, on Facebook, and I still don't talk to them. So like, when we became friends, it was also one of those things that I was like, I'm so glad I stood up for my principles. You know what I mean? Like, my mom had this saying that has haunted me, but like, not in a bad way. She said, be kind. She always used to tell me, be kind to people because you never know when you're going to see them on the other side of the street again. And like, when I was 12, I was like, I don't understand what that means. Like, that's just one of those like old Black parent, like Southern shit, excuse my French. Like, you never know what they're talking about half the time when you're a preteen. But it like stuck in my head, and I used to think about it all the time. And it had to be the Holy Spirit because there were times that I would look at people and be like, like just want to be so salty and so petty, not even for a particular reason. Sometimes out of pure laziness, because I didn't feel like putting the effort into being kind, honest to God. And like something in my head, it would be my mom, like, ooh, they're going to be on the other side of the street. I was like, I'm never going to see this person again, ever, ever. I don't even know them like that. Lo and behold, like literally, I could name the people. And so it was one of those things. And I was very tempted to just like scroll by, you know what I'm saying? Or like even like in direct messages, people were like, did you see that Jonathan got his girlfriend pregnant and
Wow.
and like I was really tempted to be like, and like just ignore it, and I didn't.
Well, I appreciate that.
So
And like,
I'm happy for that now. Not even because only it's you. It's just one of those things where like it's reinforcing what my mother is saying, which she would be so proud of herself if she could hear this right now. I know she's not watching it, but if she was. But for me, it continues to reinforce like when you have the opportunity to confront somebody on like just being wrong, like loud and wrong, like you should say something, even if it's not going to gain you anything in that moment, you know what I mean? Or like you don't necessarily see a point. Like being principled is always the point, you know? Like that's enough. And you do not ever know what seed you plant, even in a passing conversation, where that's going to end up.
and if we stood up for each other more, you know, right?
Right.
Like if we didn't stand by, so just as women, if we didn't stand by silent while we knew other
Y'all, I'm
women were
cold. It's
being,
cold over here. I'm putting on my old lady sweater. Okay.
but if we knew that, you know, like we had each other's backs instead of standing by
Exactly.
in silence while people were, you know, ridiculing someone else or, you know, talking down
One
to
of the
someone
dudes who
else.
argued with me too, he was like, well, do you even know her? I was like, I don't need to know her to know that you're being a douche. Like, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it's the truth, yeah, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, I know her boyfriend, and he obviously knows her, and so they seem to be fine. So why can't you mind your own business? Like, I don't
Right.
understand.
And I'm
Why
thankful
is
that
that so hard?
I didn't even know or have any like experience with any of that. And for me, like I did have a cousin who like had a conversation with me about, she was like, you know, so like what are your plans next? Like what do you want to do? And I was like, you know, we're just gonna have this baby and then kind of take it from there. And she was like, yeah, like don't feel pressured to get married. Like irrespective of what anybody else is saying, like you don't have to marry this man just because you had a baby with him. If you love him and you guys work together and it's something you want to do, then by all means, but don't feel pressured. And it's like I feel like we could just go on and on and on because there's so many layers to all of it. There's so just that particular experience was mine, but you know, I know that there's tons and tons of women out there who you know deal with that to varying degrees, be it just from you know the fact that they've had sex and they get married and they're not a virgin, to like getting pregnant outside of marriage and you know everything that comes with that. Um, and so I do want to deal with this question. But I'm saying all that to say um, there's a lot that we just as women experience, and there's a very, I think, wide spectrum within the context of purity culture, and all of it is damaging. And depending on the situation, you can deal with layer upon layer upon layer of it. Um, and I think specifically as women, specifically as Black women, I think it kind of speaks to what Leah said. Like, if nothing else, we have to be there for each other. Like,
Yeah.
if someone is
On that
talking
note, by
down,
the way, I realized what I wanted to say about this conversation because I've been talking to a really close guy friend about it. It just like took me a minute to
okay.
remember.
Well, then you can go ahead.
Did you talk about any of the tweets that we discussed a couple weeks ago? We didn't talk about it. The ones from all of the pastors talking about how it's transactional. We didn't bring that up yet.
No, because I feel like that was something we would talk about next week in the
Remind me what's next week.
like it's like women's sexuality and misogynoir and
Yes, but I see a tie over between the two. And this was brought to my attention by a really good guy friend of mine. So it has to do with men. It has to do with horseshoe theory. The horseshoe theory, if anybody's familiar with it, is when you take the extreme of one thing, the opposite of it is very close by when you get to the other side. And so one of the things about misogyny is that almost every ism requires the oppressor to dehumanize themselves in order to dehumanize other people. Like, you have to allow yourself to become the kind of monstrous person who would do that to someone else in order to continue in whatever oppressive beliefs you are enacting on everybody else. One of the things about purity culture that I think is important to bring up to help bring about empathy, it's ironic, but when people have lived in, when people have been coached their entire lives to only care about their viewpoint and how things affects them, sometimes you have to start there in order for them to understand how bad something actually is. In the conversation, and this is the guy who I'm talking about is not one of these people. We were talking about actually what happened weeks ago, where it was dudes who were bullying other men or harassing them when they were trying to stand up for women, and like how that plays out in the absence of women, which is usually significantly worse than even what we see. And specifically in misogyny, when it comes to purity culture, that I found this amusing. Of course, I don't know any dudes who do, but men end up getting exactly what they claim they don't want when they reinforce purity culture. Because if you are successful in brainwashing any human being born with, two X's and a vagina into thinking that her entire worth is bound up in how many times she allows anybody to penetrate her with anything sexually. If you are successful in telling a woman that her ability to be seen as respectable is based on how much of a prude she can be, when that works, when the person internalizes it and lives by it, you get a wife who doesn't want to have sex with you. Just being extremely blunt. If she wants to have sex with someone, it's not her husband. You know why? Because she's been deeply trained not to enact any, it's not just that you were taught not to factor in pleasure into your decision making. You were taught explicitly to factor it out. I was trying to explain this to a dude. So we marry men based on, the ideal list, all of this checklist of things. And since it is forbidden to have sex with anybody before you get married to them, anyone who tempts you is automatically seen as terrible. They are no longer allowed to be eligible to fit your ideal list. And so he was like, well, but then people don't marry people they're not attracted to. First of all, yes, they do. But let's follow that train of thought and assume that this woman does. There's lots of men that I find attractive that I don't ever want to sleep with. I have brothers. I have a dad. They're all very attractive. I don't want to sleep with them. There's plenty of men who look, but I'm serious. Like men they're not taught to think about these things. But I'm saying this first of all. So my background is that I did, this is me. This is talking about myself. That was me. I was a super prude to the extent that most dudes who dated me through college until I got married were sure that I was a lesbian. Nothing wrong with being lesbian. We're talking about their viewpoint, not I don't care what they thought I was. So from their point, because I was so aversive and so uncomfortable with the idea of a man being physically intimate with me, that most dudes were like, oh, well, maybe you just really don't like dudes that much. But that's not what was happening. I was explicitly dating men that fit all of the criteria that was good and none of it that was bad. So I stayed really far away from dudes who I actually had feelings for. Because if I got close to them and I felt like the blood was draining from my head into my pelvis, I immediately decided that that was the gateway to Satan and I couldn't go there anymore. How is it possible for a girl who actually buys into this to ever have a successful, intimate, passionate relationship with her husband? She's not going to marry a man who she is passionate or sexual about. So the obscenity of all of this, like so many other things, is that these men are creating the monsters they claim they don't want to be. Because these are the exact same men. This is where it gets into the tweets. Remember when we were reading like, oh, well, sex was so transactional in the beginning? Of course it was. You have created it is impossible for sex not to be seen as transactional when you tell women that that's the only value it has for them, that they're not allowed to enjoy it, that God forbid if they even imagine loving it with any man, that they're like on the speed track to destruction. If you
And
train
God
a woman to
forbid.
be like that for almost 3 decades, what are you expecting to live with when you marry her? You're going to get exactly what you made.
That's a powerful point. I don't think people really think about it that way.
But they need to.
And,
and men
do.
That's why I said when you've been in an oppressive, when you've been at the top of anything, you're only looking at that vantage point, not everything that's happening under you. Those are always the same bitter men that are complaining. It's always the same people. The ones who are the loudest about somebody being a hoe are also the loudest about how come my wife's not a hoe for me. Like that's really
and God forbid we prioritize her sexuality and pleasure.
That's for next week. We ain't even ready
like
for
it's not even possible that she's not jumping into the bedroom because what am I getting at?
Because she hates being in the bedroom with you? Because it's terrible when she gets in there? Because you have to pretend she's with somebody else?
No, and true story. Like I was never super pressed about, like I was not one of those people who was like super pressed about sex and just like, oh, I need sex. I need it right now. Because like...
That's past tense, though. Like, we're not talking about now. I'm in my mid-30s.
Right.
Something else going on in my head.
but I'm saying, like, even during the dating phase, it's like, like this whole idea that, like, women are, like, if you're out here, it's just like, you're just out here and, you're just this whore. And it's like, I mean, not really. Like, 9 times out of 10, I feel like for a lot of us, especially people who are coming from that, like, prudish mentality, it's like, I'm doing this largely because I like you. Like I'm emotionally like invested in you, not because like I can't control myself, because sir, no.
I don't know any, I mean, I'm sure that they exist. So we're not talking about that. I'm just saying in my own circle to reinforce what you're saying. I know 0 Black women who can't control themselves. If Black women couldn't control themselves, this entire country would have been burned down by now. It's never about control. It is never, ever, ever about self-control with Black women. It's always about something else.
And to underscore that, Leah, I think that purity culture, and I think that is also a tenement of purity culture. We are taught to have self-control. While, and I said this earlier before you got on, I was saying that in Black Christendom, I think that purity culture and control and temptation is very much so a woman's objective. It's very much so the responsibility of women.
It's a woman's burden.
It is a woman's burden. Men are not taught that. So while we have men in the church ravishing out here in the streets, okay, in the streets.
They are the streets, honey.
Okay. And they're
even for the streets. They are the streets.
They are the streets. Okay?
We for the streets. They are the streets. That's how it's going.
They the streets, okay? Everybody can walk down them.
That's right.
And and not saying that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but if that's your cup of tea,
if that's what you want to do,
don't do that and then judge women, because I'm like, then who are you doing these things with? You are doing them with women.
Absolutely.
But then you judge women who you want to date, but then that whole conversation of then you start to complain about it, right? And so this standard of purity culture creates women that you can't live, right? You can't win ever.
No.
You have to be a virgin, and you have to present one way to their family, but behind closed doors you have to be somebody else, and then you have
But you can't get pregnant while you're doing that.
You can't get pregnant while you're doing it. You have to be presentable
and
enough.
If you do, it's your fault because you obviously ejaculated into yourself. Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
And then you have to be like this presentable woman to society, but then you still have to be sexy enough and know how to do your makeup
in the bed, like,
for all of this, bruh. And you can't win. I'm like, okay, so if I do my hair and I do my nails and I like makeup, it teeters on. If I do too much, that in the bed. No, and I'm saying
when you go to church, it's
So you have to teeter on these lines that are just ridiculous, that are absolutely ridiculous.
And the assumption is if you are not, it's like we don't have room to just be. Like, I see people talking all the time about like women are exposing themselves on social media and it's for attention. Like, maybe I just want to post. Like, maybe I just want to post. Like, why does it have to be? It's really why does it have to be for other people or for other people's attention or whatever else? Like, maybe this is how I am most of the time. In my everyday life, and I don't want to be fake on social media, to appeal to all these people who are judgy and whatever else. Meanwhile, like, I wear crop tops. I wear crop tops all the time. I wear bikinis on the beach. I wear form-fitting dresses. I wear short shorts. Like, I live in California. I live in Los Angeles. Like, people walk around with their boobs out, in broad daylight. And so, like, it's just like, no, like, why does everything that anyone does have to be about? Why is the assumption that it has to be about somebody else? Why can't it just be like people are existing? That why does my sexuality have to be about a man and who I am or am not trying to be to a man? Why does what I wear or how I carry myself have to be about appealing to a man or these people over here? Like, why don't I have freedom to just be?
Because in Christendom, you are not supposed to be you. You're supposed to be Christ.
Right.
And I think that's it. And not saying there's anything wrong with wanting to have the character.
But no, you're not supposed to be Christ. You're supposed to be their idea of Christ.
Yeah.
Because it's not even Jesus, right?
I know.
Right.
So, that's why you have all of these things, because I've always struggled against that. Like, ever since I've been a child, like, I was always one of those free. Like, I didn't like clothes. So, like,
girl, I still don't like clothes.
My family would be like, Lord, don't let her be a stripper, Jesus, because she doesn't like clothes. And it didn't have anything to do with my sexuality. It just had everything to do with the kind of person that I am. And so for me, growing up in the church and growing up in a more conservative family, there were always struggles with my own sexuality, my own wanting to, like, I like short shorts. I like, crop tops. Do I wear them all the time as much anymore? No, but my style has changed, right? I have gone from I like really
and that's your decision,
right? And I think that as you go through changes in your life, your style evolves. Like I was a tomboy phase, and now I'm kind of like I like these kind of basics. I like more flowy things. I'm just in this different space in my life. But there were times when I would have conversations, and especially my mom, like, would you want people to know you were wearing that or doing that? And I'm like, do I care?
Right.
But the culture is because she didn't want me to be seen that way.
Right.
She didn't want people to judge her as if her mothering is bad in that way.
Right. And then your daughter out here in these streets and so
out here in these streets.
Home? Right.
And I'm like, I'm in the streets. Okay. I'm living my best 20-year-old life. And I was having that conversation with my mom the other day, and I was like, I'm glad that, I lived my 20s on my terms and not the terms that everybody else wanted, because I think the backlash of purity culture is that for men and women, you get to this age where you can't fake the funk anymore. And so you have women in their 40s or in their 50s, these marriages dissolving, these women and men having midlife crisis and going off and trying to live that life that they wanted to live, but they couldn't live. And now,
something nobody
And
wants to talk
affairs.
about. Like, that isn't that the real thing you should want to be avoiding in the church, not people having consenting relationships before they're committed?
Because the reality is that it's whatever you really want to do is going to happen eventually.
Absolutely.
No matter how long you suppress it.
Right.
So, and the reality is, if we would let people have their own choices in their 20s, you may not have people, doing what they want to do in their 50s, and it causing damage because there's more people attached to them now. There's
Can I get
children,
into that? Because
yeah,
I want to get
families,
into that.
all of that.
So I think that's a perfect segue back into what I was saying. This is the other, as somebody who's in the field that I'm in, who I usually work with people for couples with a solid year. Sometimes it's more than a year. And without a shadow of a doubt, and this is regardless of race, if they come from a fundamental Christian evangelical background, I have noticed that what I experienced is not limited to me. Women really are marrying based off of appeal and image to other people because they're being raised that that's what the priority is. But like you said, especially after the kids get here, that first one. First of all, men don't understand that women's hormone. Well, there's two things. There's something really important going on, and this is just the scientific part. There are extensive studies that have been done worldwide that show. You guys know about pheromones, I'm assuming. You know about pheromones. Most of our generation does. Our parents did not know so much. So pheromones are a huge beacon that determine greatly our like involuntary sexual attraction, right? For people who don't know. And it's basically what you smell subconsciously. It's not a conscious thing. But very consciously goes from the very back of your mind, literally the most instinctual part, to the forefront, and significantly affects women's decisions, especially even more than men, about who we are driven. It's not even a desire, it's drive. It's who you are driven to bed, not wed, get in the bed with, literally. So something our generation doesn't know, and this is not, I love birth control and I love condoms and I am very pro-choice, so this has nothing to do with that. This is just information for people to know. When women take any hormone that their body has not produced itself, it significantly suppresses hormonal activity, recognition, and reactivity. Have been dating people who we don't have a deep sexual drive for. So this is taking out the fundamentalism. But when you add it in, that's so many layers. So now you have a potential biological layer. You have no idea who you're actually sexually driven to be interested in because you've never had the opportunity. But even if you gave yourself the opportunity, like if you were one of those fundamentalists who like didn't even get on birth control, which is me, because I wasn't having sex with anybody. So we're not going to do this. There's other reasons. And they thought, I needed it for like hormonal balancing or whatever. But I got on it. I hated it. I had morning sickness, literally, when I was on birth control. Mind you, this was like 17, 18 years ago. So there weren't nearly as many options. But I felt like crap. And I was like, I don't need this. And if for some strange, godforsaken reason, like, just give me condoms. I'm not going to be sick every day when I'm not even pregnant. I'm not going to do it. So I didn't take it. But during the time that I did take it, I dated guys, and like literally I came off of it and I was like, whoa, like I went into, couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand how they smelled after basketball practice, like the real basic stuff. It had nothing to do with them. And you might be like, well, everybody stinks after they sweat. That's what you think until your pheromones get a hold of you. And I guarantee you will find somebody who you don't think stinks after they sweat. There's 8 billion people on the planet. And biology would never set you up that you hated how everybody smelled after they sweat, because if you've had sex, you're going to interact with somebody's sweat. You can't hate how it smells while it's happening, or else you won't continue. You certainly won't love it, right? And so like these are the big, but we don't ever get this information, because as a fundamentalist, you're not allowed to know any of this information, right? La, 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 plug your ears. You add that on top of the fact that you're not just creating a culture where you cannot account for, like, it's not neutral towards pleasure. it trains women to be aversive towards pleasure. So you have two things that are making you run from men that make you want to take your bras off and burn them, right? And see, when I say that, like in my early 20s, I didn't even know it was, I was confused, honestly, in my naivety at this phenomenon of women like being like, like drooling like zombies over dudes. Like, how can you feel this way about a man? I had literally never, I could not fathom it. And I thought, like, oh, I must be completely asexual. Like, this just must be a weird thing for me. Nothing wrong with being asexual, but that's not my point. It was like leading me towards identities that weren't actually mine because I was so deeply indoctrinated that I couldn't fathom having this sort of interaction with another human who was male because I had been trained so deeply to despise it that I wouldn't even allow myself to get into those situations. The one time, there we go. The funny thing is, this particular dude, he had liked me for like years, and I was really, 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 really mean to him. And I eventually realized somewhere in my early 20s that I was losing my shit in the back of my mind, losing it. Fear because I thought I was going to be harmed. It wasn't because of that. I was terrified because there was something happening inside of me that like I was like, why do I want to take my clothes off? I had been deeply trained. That's terrible. You can't feel that way and you for fuck sure can't act on it. Excuse me. Like you can't act on it if you feel like that. You can never tell anybody you feel that way. That's terrible. You can't feel like that. So when we as women are reinforcing this, we have to think about what are we really doing. So fast forward, you get women in their 30s who are married probably already to whatever dude hit their ideal list, right? And they have a kid like they're supposed to, and we have careers and all of the checklists just being checked off. Maybe you bought a house. For a lot of women, this is the first time they come off of their birth control. The type of appointments these women are having with me behind closed doors are tragic. They might like their husbands as people. They usually do. Like, he's a good person. I'm sure he'd be great for someone else. But when you are sleepless, when you are hungry, when you are bloated, you're potentially cut, when you're having all of these things, you're no longer at work. Like you're just stuck at home with a baby who's crying, with a dude who comes home and he tries to touch you. You want to hit him with a spatula. Like, don't touch me. I need the space for me. Like, it's not, there's so many things you can't ignore. And at first they'll be like, maybe I just don't like men. And then they'll go to literally, I'm thinking of so many of my patients. They'll go to the grocery store or the coffee shop, or I don't know, just anywhere in public pre-pandemic. And some dude, they're off their birth control. Some dude is there and they're like, why am I like, is this also my hormones? Like, to an extent, but it's also the fact that you've been like suppressing what you're actually interested in and who you're actually attracted to for, I don't know, 15 years because you were trained to do that. It's terrible. The irony of this is that it's not just like what's happening to men individually in marriages. If we wanted to like motivate them to, this is why you don't do this to your daughters, on a collective level, the church is literally creating the very types of relationships that it claims it wants to avoid, which is setting people up for divorce disasters. You're setting people up for divorce. Like, that's not sustainable. You can't put two people in a house where at least one of them doesn't have any biological sexual drive for them and isn't marrying them for reasons that have to do with actual like bonding. What do you expect is going to happen? And even if they stay together, it's going to be a terrible marriage. And in that terrible marriage, or even subpar marriage, their kids are growing up watching something awful happen and then realizing, oh, the connecting point is God. Like, I just feel like there's leaving. This is one of them, though. Like in an So my hope is that now that our generation has learned, like, man, maybe this isn't actually the best way to like. And yes, of course, I know that there are people who this is not their story, but they're the exception. They're not the rule. We can all think of, like, I can think of so many of my friends' parents, my own parents who got divorced when I got divorced, ironically, at almost 30 years, right? We're also being taught other things, like love is not tolerance. Tolerance is involved in love, but equating the two is awful. And like that is also what purity culture leads to. It leads to you being told that somehow tolerance is the same as affection and passion. You know what I mean? And like it's not. It's not, and it's not just a feeling. Like if you want to look at what drives people to be self-sacrificial, what drives people every night to want to still come home even after they had an argument to still try, it's not tolerance. If you've ever been around somebody who tolerates you, I guarantee you know that's not where it's going, right? Passion does, though. An incredibly deep metaphysical emotional bond with someone that always has to be forged and reinforced with physical contact absolutely does. That drives everybody home. Those are the things that end you up on people's doorsteps and you don't know why you're there and you can't really explain it, but you just know that you couldn't keep going home without seeing this person. Where do you think those things come from? I was talking to a different friend in a podcast and they were talking about safety, and that potentially in the Black community that this is seen as a threat to social cohesion. And that's something that I buy. Like, we just aren't stable enough as Black people in society yet to have space for romance. I think that's such a deep thought and it's heartbreaking. But to me, it's one of the things that makes sense. And it's like the only explanation somebody's given me that would explain why we as a culture have become so deeply invested in something that doesn't serve us when it comes to purity culture. I don't know. That's my whole like collective thought, taking away my own self. But it's, yeah.
I think that makes sense. Everything you said and the whole, like, I guess the psychology behind why the Black community specifically may be kind of like buying into it. And I wanted to say this really quickly and then we'll answer this question and then we have to go. But I think that the other side of it too, but beyond just like breaking out of, feeling repressed, whatever that may look like for an individual, I think that because I think being conservative looks and feels like oppression because it's been forced on so many people who it is not a natural fit for. People who it maybe would work for, who would feel comfortable in that space and be able to thrive in it, almost feel like they can't, engage in it without there being some stigma attached to it as well. And I think for me that the takeaway has always been, just with regard to sexuality, like, you have to give people room to just be who they are, whatever that looks like. Because I think that there are men and women who are just not like super passionate, emotional people. And so that's not what their life is going to be driven by. And for those people, just having a chill, we come together, we have sex, maybe, but like our relationship is based on other things because that's who we are. That's perfectly fine. If you are a woman and you want to be a stay-at-home mom, you want your husband to be the breadwinner and a traditional, home setup works for you, by all means, do what you do. If you believe that God doesn't want you to have sex before marriage and you need to wait, and that's what you feel convicted of, and you can't engage in physical intimacy with someone in peace because it goes against your conviction, then by all means, live that, stick with it, do what you got to do. But the problem is when we take what works for us as individuals and try to apply it universally and then demonize and shame and guilt trip
people when they don't conform
for not conforming to what I have been convicted of is the truth. And being okay with those differences existing. Because I think that's ultimately, I think, what it boils down to. Those differences are always going to be there because we're all different people. And we all have to learn to be okay with giving each other room to just be. And I think as women specifically, we deserve to have room to just be who we are and to exist and to live and to not have every little thing that we do be critiqued. Like, there's nothing wrong with staying home. There's nothing wrong with working. There's nothing wrong with having kids. There's nothing wrong with not having kids. You are not inadequate as a woman if you can't have children. Like, you're still deserving. You're still worthy. Whatever your life has looked like, whatever decisions you have made, your value is in the fact that you exist. You're a human life. You're here. And that means something. And whether or not you can stand by all of the decisions that you've made, because, maybe not all of us can, that still doesn't take away from your value as a person. And we have to stop putting our value in things that are extraneous, be it sex, be it religion, be it gender identity, be it race, whatever else. Like, you have to start putting your value and finding your validation just in who you are as a person, and accepting that and loving that, and allowing whatever else, is a part of who you are to stem from that place of self-love and self-respect and self-worth. So we have this question from Adenike, I hope I'm saying that right, Kay. And it was split into two comments, but it says, what do you think about churches using the commandment to not commit adultery as the reason to not have sex before marriage?
It's ridiculous. I don't know how to.
For me, adultery only refers to marriage, right?
Yeah, the Bible's very explicit. You touched on this, and I love that. But just to reinforce, like, people love to be like, the Bible's a consistent book, which is a conversation for a completely different podcast. But I'm always like, tell me your train of thought and let's ride it to the station. Because inevitably in these situations, your train is off track, your own train. We don't even have to talk about how I feel about the situation. Let's point out how irrational your own thoughts are. Like, if we assume the Bible is both literal and consistent, then why, if God meant fornication specifically, was it not there? Even adultery, and this is like, a conversation you and I have had, Cara, this is all assuming that we are dealing with an accurate translation.
No, because I was going to ask, like, who decided that fornication is referring to
It's not.
Where did that come from?
It's not
an LGBTQ one for that. Because remember,
when you go back,
it was never about that. It was always about pedophilia.
When you go back, and not even that, when you go back to the original text, when you look it up, it's the Greek word. And not only one, in some certain circumstances, it is pedophilia. In other circumstances, fornication is directly, we're talking about idolatry. Thank you. Yeah, I can say it.
Idol worship. Idol worship.
But it's specific in Greek culture. It's the idol worship where you go to the temples where they have sex and as an offering to the god.
Yes, it's temple prostitution.
Temple prostitution in the Bible. If God meant that, why do we have to infer it?
Help me. And who decided that it needs to be inferred?
But here's more importantly, even if it does mean that, then God is a liar, because almost every patriarch and prophet
had like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 wives.
No. Listen,
concubines aren't
concubines. No. But this, and whoever's listening, you can go look this up. This is when, and I think it's in 2 Kings. I think, or maybe not 2 Kings. I don't remember exactly where it's at. But when David had sex with, we can say raped Bathsheba.
Yeah,
and Nathan comes to talk to David afterwards.
Yes.
And Nathan, gives a whole parable about the guy with the one lamb and the flock, and how the guy with the flock took the one lamb.
Right.
Nathan starts speaking for God after David after he said, like, you are this man. You are the man who has taken this. God goes down this list of things that he has given David. That God has given David. You know what's on that list of things?
Wives.
Saul's wives. Not even his own. Saul's wives.
Somebody else's wives.
And you know what else God said? I would have given you more. If you had asked, I would have given you more. The problem was not that he had sex with Bathsheba, or that he took advantage of Bathsheba.
Coveted
the problem,
his wife.
Yeah,
it set up murder,
and the problem was that he took somebody. It was the fact that she was somebody else's wife.
Right.
Like, and we're talking about like a patriarchal society. Like, let's not even talk about Bathsheba's like what she wanted, consent,
Nah, nobody
any of
cared
that
about
stuff.
that.
It's the fact she's compared in the parable, she's compared to property.
Mm-hmm.
Livestock. We're gonna be specific.
Like and you know, and it's just like, you cannot tell me there is no scenario where a God who had every opportunity to speak about sexual sin in that scenario
And spoke about plenty of others.
and did not somehow, and this is one example of many, because he didn't talk about it to any of them. Abraham,
No.
Isaac, he's wrestling with Jacob.
He didn't say it in the 10 Commandments.
Not a word.
Let me tell you what story drives home how
you
much
can't
BS
tell
this
me.
is.
You cannot
it's the
tell
story
me.
of Rahab.
Oh yeah.
Rahab is an actual like dom mistress. That woman runs a damn brothel. Not only does God not tell her anything about stopping it, he uses the brothel. He doesn't just use it. He tells his lovely patriarchs and prophets to stay there and enjoy themselves. If you're too stupid to figure out what that means, that is on you. It is not on me. I'm just saying. Like, I'm not going to have a conversation with you because you're slow. My life moves too fast for that. You figure that out by yourself.
He never
told her anything about what she was doing, much less to stop. He gave her other instructions, and he used her profession, for lack of a better way of explaining it, for his glory to hide them. In the meantime, she lied on them while they were there. And God was like, that's right, I can work with that. Excuse me? The issue is not fornication, you fools. Like, I can't for my play. But everybody will bend over backwards as far as they possibly can to justify sexism.
And
Everyone.
you know, before you got here, before you came on, Leah, I had talked about that because I was telling Ashley, like, I feel like just within Christianity in general, we take
a man. Can we talk about that? Because I love that story.
It's all of
they plotted. No. She didn't seduce. They plotted.
Seriously.
They plotted.
Right. And if do we really think that she just laid at his feet?
Of course.
No.
That was okay.
No.
In all the history classes I took, that's actually supposed to be a metaphor for fellatio.
Oh.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. No, she didn't lay at his feet. What is she doing at his feet?
Right.
Because first of all, and if she was only at his feet, then why did he like remove? It talks about like a specific removal, but that is like a part of the clothes that covers the genitalia. Like, what are you doing that for? Right. Even at your feet, brah.
No, and what I was saying to Ashley before you came on, Leah, was
she
that
was like,
I feel like
to drink. I have something for you. We're getting married in the morning. You guys are going to take care of.
When we do like that, when we talk about progress, and people can recognize that there's issues with certain aspects of a particular mindset, but they're not willing to do the work to unpack all of it. It's like, for me, if somebody tells me something and I find out that a piece of it is wrong, like you tell me something,
everything's wrong. Don't talk to me anymore.
And you have an agenda, not just that it's wrong,
Absolutely.
but you know that there's at least a possibility that it's not correct, and you tell me the incorrect information because it benefits you to not tell me the truth. There's no way that I'm going to continue. I'm going to say, okay, I know this piece isn't true, but everything else must be accurate. And so I'm still going to rely on that in my estimation of what is and is not true. Like, no, if this piece of information is incorrect, then I need to assume that I need to take everything that you said with a grain of salt. And so, again, believe what you want to believe. But, this is not to, bash anyone or come at anyone who has their beliefs, but do the work. If there's so much scholarship, so much information, we live in 2021, Google is free. If there's so much out there that is available to you in terms of just understanding what is being communicated, what the message is, then for me, there is no excuse, if nothing else, to know it. And if you are going to believe it, to take ownership of all of it. Don't, try to, mix and match the pieces that you think are relevant or that are comfortable enough for you. Like, take all of it and whatever you believe, take ownership of it. Take ownership of what it says about you, what it says about God and the potential impact it has on people around you as they are receiving this messaging from you. Because if you're doing that, then I have no quarrels. Because if people have all the information, they know everything that it's coming from, and they still decide to believe it, that is their prerogative. The problem I have is there being so much misinformation. And instead of doing the work to unpack it, if nothing else, just to know what it is that you actually believe, like making excuses for it or trying to rationalize it away, and then shaming and guilt tripping people who aren't willing to do that and who choose not to live their lives based on what they understandably believe to be lies.
Right.
So yeah, I do have to go. I appreciate you guys for taking the time to have this conversation. If anyone, sees this and has any other questions that you would like to see us address or hear us talk about, by all means, let us know. Next week, we will be kind of piggybacking on this conversation a little bit to talk about misogynoir and and female sexuality. Leah is our resident expert in those areas, and so I'm looking forward to just hearing from her and learning about me as a woman and maybe whatever internalized patriarchy and misogyny I may have.
Well, I'm impressed to be able to teach other people about their own womanhood, but I can talk about our collective experience. Certainly.
That we can learn from that, right?
Yeah.
So tune in next week to hear about that. And
are we able to take people's questions? People can send in their questions ahead of time. It's a lot easier to deal with it if I've seen it ahead of time than on the spot.
If you see this or hear this in the lead up to next week, by all means send any of us a DM. You can DM any of the pages, the One World Church or the One World Church podcast. And yes, we're looking forward to talking with each other and y'all next week.
Yeah.
Bye.
The next week will be fun.
Bye.
Bye.